Chapter 31. It will smell, I said, but it will keep in the heat and keep out the rain and snow. We were surveying the completed sealskin roof. It is clumsy, but it will serve the purpose, and that is the main thing, I went on, yearning for her praise. And she clapped her hands and declared that she was hugely pleased. "But it is dark in here," she said the next moment, her shoulders shrinking with a little involuntary shiver. "You might have suggested a window when the walls were going up," I said. "It was for you, and you should have seen the need of a window." "But I never do see the obvious, you know," she laughed back. "And besides, you can knock a hole in the wall at any time." "Quite true. I had not thought of it," I replied, wagging my head sagely. "But have you thought of ordering the window glass? Just call up the firm, Red 4451, I think it is, and tell them what size and what kind of glass you wish." "That means," she began, "no window." It was a dark and evil-appearing thing, that hut, not fit for aught better than swine in a civilized land. But for us, who had known the misery of the open boat, it was a snug little habitation. Following the housewarming, which was accomplished by means of seal oil and a wick made from cotton caulking, came the hunting for our winter's meat and the building of the second hut. It was a simple affair now to go forth in the morning and return by noon with a boatload of seals. And then, while I worked at building the hut, Maud tried out the oil from the blubber and kept a slow fire under the frames of meat. I had heard of jerking beef on the plains, and our seal meat, cut in thin strips and hung in the smoke, cured excellently. The second hut was easier to erect, for I built it against the first and only 3 walls were required. But it was work, hard work, all of it. Maud and I worked from dawn till dark, to the limit of our strength, so that when night came we crawled stiffly to bed and slept the animal-like sleep of exhaustion. And yet Maud declared that she had never felt better or stronger in her life. I knew this was true of myself, but hers was such a lily strength that I feared she would break down. Often and often, her last reserve force gone, I have seen her stretch flat on her back on the sand in the way she had of resting and recuperating. And then she would be up on her feet and toiling hard as ever. Where she obtained this strength was the marvel to me. "Think of the long rest this winter," was her reply to my remonstrances. "Why, we'll be clamorous for something to do." We held a housewarming in my hut. The night it was roofed. It was the end of the 3rd day of a fierce storm which had swung around the compass from the southeast to the northwest, which was then blowing directly in upon us. The beaches of the outer cove were thundering with the surf, and even in our landlocked inner cove a respectable sea was breaking. No high backbone of island sheltered us from the wind, and it whistled and bellowed about the hut till at times I feared for the strength of the walls. The skin roof stretched tightly as a drumhead. I had thought sagged and bellied with every gust, and innumerable interstices in the walls, not so tightly stuffed with moss as Maud had supposed, disclosed themselves. Yet the seal oil burned brightly, and we were warm and comfortable. It was a pleasant evening indeed, and we voted that as a social function on Endeavor Island, it had not yet been eclipsed. Our minds were at ease. Not only had we resigned ourselves to the bitter winter, but we were prepared for it. The seals could depart on their mysterious journey into the south at any time, now, for all we cared, and the storms held no terror for us. Not only were we sure of being dry and warm and sheltered from the wind, but we had the softest and most luxurious mattresses that could be made from moss. This had been Maud's idea, and she had herself jealously gathered all the moss. This was to be my first night on the mattress, and I knew I should sleep the sweeter because she had made it. As she rose to go, she turned to me with the whimsical way she had and said, "Something is going to happen, is happening for that matter. I feel it. Something is coming here, to us. It is coming now. I don't know what, but it is coming." "Good or bad?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't know, but it is there, somewhere." She pointed in the direction of the sea and wind. "It's a lee shore," I laughed, "and I am sure I'd rather be here than arriving a night like this." "You are not frightened?" I asked as I stepped to open the door for her. Her eyes looked bravely into mine. "And you feel well? Perfectly well?" "Never better," was her answer. We talked a little longer before she went. "Good night, Maud," I said. "Good night, Humphrey," she said. This use of our given names had come about quite as a matter of course, and was as unpremeditated as it was natural. In that moment, I could have put my arms around her and drawn her to me. I should certainly have done so out in that world to which we belonged. As it was, the situation stopped there in the only way it could, but I was left alone in my little hut, glowing warmly through and through, with a pleasant satisfaction, and I knew that a tie, or a tacit something, existed between us which had not existed before. Chapter 32. I awoke, oppressed by a mysterious sensation. There seemed something missing in my environment, but the mystery and oppressiveness vanished after the first few seconds of waking, when I identified the missing something as the wind. I had fallen asleep in that state of nerve tension with which one meets the continuous shock of sound or movement, and I had awakened, still tense, bracing myself to meet the pressure of something which no longer bore upon me. It was the first night I had spent under cover in several months, and I lay luxuriously for some minutes under my blankets, for once not wet with fog or spray, analyzing, first, the effect produced upon me by the cessation of the wind, and next the joy which was mine from resting on the mattress made by Maud's hands. When I had dressed and opened the door, I heard the waves still lapping on the beach, garrulously attesting the fury of the night. It was a clear day, and the sun was shining. I had slept late, and I stepped outside with sudden energy, bent upon making up lost time, as befitted a dweller on Endeavor Island. And when outside, I stopped short. I believed my eyes without question, and yet I was for the moment stunned by what they disclosed to me. There on the beach, not 50 feet away, bow on, dismasted, was a black-hulled vessel. Masts and booms, tangled with shrouds, sheets, and rent canvas, were rubbing gently alongside. I could have rubbed my eyes as I looked. There was the homemade galley we had built, the familiar break of the poop, the low yacht cabin scarcely rising above the rail. It was the Ghost. What freak of fortune had brought it here? Here of all spots. What chance of chances? I looked at the bleak, inaccessible wall at my back and know the profundity of despair. Escape was hopeless, out of the question. I thought of Maud, asleep there in the hut we had reared. I remembered her. Good night, Humphrey. My woman, my mate, went ringing through my brain. But now, alas, it was a knell that sounded. Then everything went black before my eyes. Possibly it was the fraction of a second, but I had no knowledge of how long an interval had lapsed before I was myself again. There lay the Ghost, bow on to the beach, her splintered bowsprit projecting over the sand, her tangled spars rubbing against her side to the lift of the crooning waves. Something must be done, must be done. It came upon me suddenly, as strange, that nothing moved aboard. Wearied from the night of struggle and wreck, all hands were yet asleep, I thought. My next thought was that Maud and I might yet escape. If we could take the boat and make round the point before anyone awoke, I would call her and start. My hand was lifted at her door to knock, when I recollected the smallness of the island. We could never hide ourselves upon it. There was nothing for us but the wide, raw ocean. I thought of our snug little huts, our supplies of meat and oil and moss and firewood, and I knew that we could never survive the wintry sea and the great storms which were to come. So I stood with hesitant knuckle without her door. It was impossible. A wild thought of rushing in and killing her as she slept rose in my mind, and then in a flash the better solution came to me. All hands were asleep. Why not creep aboard the Ghost while I knew the way to Wolf Larsen's bunk and kill him in his sleep? After that, well, we would see. But with him dead, there was time and space in which to prepare to do other things. And besides, whatever new situation arose, it could not possibly be worse than the present one. My knife was at my hip. I returned to my hut for the shotgun and made sure it was loaded and went down to the Ghost. With some difficulty, and at the expense of wetting to the waist, I climbed aboard. The forecastle scuttle was open. I paused to listen for the breathing of men. But there was no breathing. I almost gasped as the thought came to me. What if the Ghost is deserted? I listened more closely. There was no sound. I cautiously descended the ladder. The place had the empty and musty feel and smell usual to a dwelling no longer inhabited. Everywhere was a thick litter of discarded and ragged garments, old sea boots, leaky oilskins, all the worthless forecastle dunnage of a long voyage. Abandoned hastily was my conclusion as I ascended to the deck. Hope was alive again in my breast, and I looked about me with greater coolness. I noted that the boats were missing. The steerage told the same tale as the forecastle. The hunters had picked their belongings with similar haste. The Ghost was deserted. It was Maud's and mine. I thought of the ship's stores and the lazaret beneath the cabin. The idea came to me of surprising Maud with something nice for breakfast. The reaction from my fear and the knowledge that the terrible deed I had come to do was no longer necessary made me boyish and eager. I went up the steerage companionway 2 steps at a time, with nothing distinct in my mind except joy and the hope that Maud would sleep on until the surprise breakfast was quite ready for her. As I rounded the galley, a new satisfaction was mine. At thought of all the splendid cooking utensils inside, I sprang up the break of the poop and saw Wolf Larsen. What of my impetus and the stunning surprise, I clattered 3 or 4 steps along the deck before I could stop myself. He was standing in the companionway. Only his head and shoulders were visible, staring straight at me. His arms were resting on the half-open slide. He made no movement whatsoever, simply stood there, staring at me. I began to tremble. The old stomach sickness clutched me. I put one hand on the edge of the house to steady myself. My lips seemed suddenly dry, and I moistened them against the need of speech. Nor did I for an instant take my eyes off him. Neither of us spoke. There was something ominous in his silence, his immobility, and my old fear of him returned, and my new fear was increased an 100-fold. And still we stood, the pair of us, staring at each other. I was aware of the demand for action, and my old helplessness strong upon me, I was waiting for him to take the initiative. Then, as the moments went by, it came to me that the situation was analogous to the one in which I had approached the long-maned bull, my intention of clubbing obscured by fear, until it became a desire to make him run. So it was at last impressed upon me that I was there, not to have Wolf Larsen take the initiative, but to take it myself. I cocked both barrels and leveled the shotgun at him. Had he moved, attempted to drop down the companionway, I know I would have shot him. But he stood motionless, staring as before, and as I faced him, with leveled gun shaking in my hands, I had time to note the worn and haggard appearance of his face. It was as if some strong anxiety had wasted it. The cheeks were sunken, and there was a wearied, puckered expression on the brow, and it seemed to me that his eyes were strange, not only the expression but the physical seeming, as though the optic nerves and supporting muscles had suffered strain and slightly twisted the eyeballs. All this I saw, and my brain now working rapidly. I thought 1,000 thoughts, and yet I could not pull the triggers. I lowered the gun and stepped to the corner of the cabin, primarily to relieve the tension on my nerves and make a new start, and incidentally to be closer. Again, I raised the gun. He was almost at arm's length. There was no hope for him. I was resolved. There was no possible chance of missing him, no matter how poor my marksmanship. And yet I wrestled with myself and could not pull the triggers. "Well?" he demanded impatiently. I strove vainly to force my fingers down on the triggers, and vainly I strove to say something. "Why don't you shoot?" he asked. I cleared my throat of a huskiness which prevented speech. "Hump," he said slowly, "you can do it. You are not exactly afraid. You are impotent. Your conventional morality is stronger than you. You are the slave to the opinions which have credence among the people you have known and have read about. Their code has been drummed into your head from the time you lisped, and in spite of your philosophy and of what I have taught you, it won't let you kill an unarmed, unresisting man. I know it, I said hoarsely. And you know that I would kill an unarmed man as readily as I would smoke a cigar, he went on. You know me for what I am, my worth in the world by your standard. You have called me a snake, tiger, shark, monster, and Caliban. And yet, you little rag puppet, you little echoing mechanism, you are unable to kill me as you would a snake or a shark, because I have hands, feet, and a body shaped somewhat like yours. Bah, I had hoped better things of you, Humph. He stepped out of the companionway and came up to me. Put down that gun. I want to ask you some questions. I haven't had a chance to look around yet. What place is this? How is the ghost lying? How did you get wet? Where's Maud? I beg your pardon, Miss Brewster. Or should I say Mrs. Van Wyden? I backed away from him, almost weeping at my inability to shoot him, but not fool enough to put down the gun. I hoped desperately that he might commit some hostile act, attempt to strike me or choke me, for in such way only I knew I could be stirred to shoot. This is Endeavor Island, I said. Never heard of it, he broke in. Well, at least that's our name for it, I amended. Our? He queried. Who's our? Miss Brewster and myself. And the ghost is lying, as you can see for yourself, bow on to the beach. There are seals here, he said. They woke me up with their barking. Or I'd be sleeping yet. I heard them when I drove in last night. They were the first warning that I was on a lee shore. It's a rookery, the kind of thing I've hunted for years. Thanks to my brother Death, I've lighted on a fortune. It's a mint. What's its bearings? Haven't the least idea, I said, but you ought to know quite closely. What were your last observations? He smiled inscrutably, but did not answer. Well, where's all hands? I asked. How does it come that you are alone? I was prepared for him again to set aside my question, and was surprised at the readiness of his reply. My brother got me inside 48 hours, and through no fault of mine, boarded me in the night with only the watch on deck. Hunters went back on me. He gave them a bigger lay. Heard him offering it. Did it right before me. Of course, the crew gave me the go-by. That was to be expected. All hands went over the side, and there I was, marooned on my own vessel. It was Death's turn, and it's all in the family, anyway. But how did you lose the masts? I asked. Walk over and examine those lanyards, he said, pointing to where the mizzen rigging should have been. They have been cut with a knife, I exclaimed. Not quite, he laughed. It was a neater job. Look again. I looked. The lanyards had been almost severed, with just enough left to hold the shrouds till some severe strain should be put upon them. Cookie did that, he laughed again. I know, though I didn't spot him at it. Kind of evened up the score a bit. Good for Mugridge, I cried. Yes, that's what I thought when everything went over the side, only I said it on the other side of my mouth. But what were you doing while all this was going on? I asked. My best, you may be sure, which wasn't much under the circumstances. I turned to re-examine Thomas Mugridge's work. I guess I'll sit down and take the sunshine, I heard Wolf Larsen saying. There was a hint, just a slight hint, of physical feebleness in his voice, and it was so strange that I looked quickly at him. His hand was sweeping nervously across his face as though he were brushing away cobwebs. I was puzzled. The whole thing was so unlike the Wolf Larsen I had known. "How are your headaches?" I asked. "They still trouble me," was his answer. "I think I have one coming on now." He slipped down from his sitting posture till he lay on the deck. Then he rolled over on his side, his eyes resting on the biceps of the underarm, the forearm shielding his eyes from the sun. I stood regarding him wonderingly. "Now's your chance, Hump," he said. "I don't understand." I lied, for I thoroughly understood. "Oh, nothing," he added softly, as if he were drowsing. "Only you've got me where you want me." "No, I haven't," I retorted, "for I want you a few thousand miles away from here." He chuckled and therefore spoke no more. He did not stir as I passed by him and went down into the cabin. I lifted the trap in the floor, but for some moments gazed dubiously into the darkness of the lazaret beneath. I hesitated to descend. What if his lying down were a ruse? Pretty, indeed, to be caught there like a rat. I crept softly up the companionway and peeped at him. He was lying as I had left him. Again I went below. But before I dropped into the lazaret, I took the precaution of casting down the door in advance. At least there would be no lid to the trap. But it was all needless. I regained the cabin with a store of jams, sea biscuits, canned meats, and such things, all I could carry, and replaced the trap door. A peep at Wolf Larsen showed me that he had not moved. A bright thought struck me. I stole into his stateroom and possessed myself of his revolvers. There were no other weapons, though I thoroughly ransacked the 3 remaining staterooms to make sure I returned and went through the steerage and forecastle, and in the galley gathered up all the sharp meat and vegetable knives. Then I bethought me of the great yachtsman's knife he always carried, and I came to him and spoke to him. First softly, then loudly. He did not move. I bent over and took it from his pocket. I breathed more freely. He had no arms with which to attack me from a distance, while I, armed, could always forestall him should he attempt to grapple me with his terrible gorilla arms. Filling a coffee pot and frying pan with part of my plunder and taking some chinaware from the cabin pantry, I left Wolf Larsen lying in the sun and went ashore. Maud was still asleep. I blew up the embers. We had not yet arranged a winter kitchen, and quite feverishly cooked the breakfast. Toward the end, I heard her moving about within the hut, making her toilet. Just as all was ready and the coffee poured, the door opened and she came forth. "It's not fair of you," was her greeting. "You are usurping one of my prerogatives. You know I agreed that the cooking should be mine, but just this once," I pleaded. "If you promise not to do it again," she smiled, "unless, of course, you have grown tired of my poor efforts." To my delight, she never once looked toward the beach, and I maintained the banter with such success, all unconsciously, she sipped the coffee from the china cup, ate fried evaporated potatoes, and spread marmalade on her biscuit. But it could not last. I saw the surprise that came over her. She had discovered the china plate from which she was eating. She looked over the breakfast, noting detail after detail. Then she looked at me, and her face turned slowly toward the beach. Humphrey, she said, the old innameable terror mounted in her eyes. Is he? She quavered. I nodded my head. Chapter 33. We waited all day for Wolf Larsen to come ashore. It was an intolerable period of anxiety. Each moment, one or the other of us cast expectant glances toward the ghost. But he did not come. He did not even appear on deck. Perhaps it is his headache, I said. I left him lying on the poop. He may lie there all night. I think I'll go and see. Maud looked entreaty at me. It's all right, I assured her. I shall take the revolvers. You know I collected every weapon on board. But there are his arms, his hands, his terrible, terrible hands, she objected. And then she cried, Oh, Humphrey, I'm afraid of him. Don't go, please don't go. She rested her hand appealingly on mine and sent my pulse fluttering. My heart was surely in my eyes for a moment, the dear and lovely woman. And she was so much the woman, clinging and appealing, sunshine and dew to my manhood, rooting it deeper and sending through it the sap of a new strength. I was for putting my arm around her, as when in the midst of the seal herd, but I considered and refrained. I shall not take any risks, I said. I'll merely peep over the bow and see. She pressed my hand earnestly and let me go, but the space on deck where I had left him lying was vacant. He had evidently gone below. That night we stood alternate watches, one of us sleeping at a time, for there was no telling what Wolf Larsen might do. He was certainly capable of anything. The next day we waited, and the next, and still he made no sign. These headaches of his, these attacks, Maud said on the afternoon of the fourth day. Perhaps he is ill, very ill. He may be dead. Or dying, was her afterthought when she had waited some time for me to speak. Better so, I answered. But think, Humphrey, a fellow creature in his last lonely hour. Perhaps, I suggested. Yes, even perhaps, she acknowledged, but we do not know. It would be terrible if he were. I could never forgive myself. We must do something. Perhaps, I suggested again. I waited, smiling inwardly at the woman of her which compelled a solicitude for Wolf Larsen, of all creatures. Where was her solicitude for me, I thought? For me, whom she had been afraid to have merely peep aboard. She was too subtle not to follow the trend of my silence, and she was as direct as she was subtle. You must go aboard, Humphrey, and find out, she said, and if you want to laugh at me, you have my consent and forgiveness. I arose obediently and went down to the beach. Do be careful, she called after me. I waved my arm from the forecastle head and dropped down the deck. After I walked to the cabin companion, where I contented myself with hailing below. Wolf Larsen answered, and as he started to ascend the stairs, I cocked my revolver. I displayed it openly during our conversation, but took no notice of it. He appeared the same, physically, as when last I saw him, but he was gloomy and silent. In fact, the few words we spoke could hardly be called a conversation. I did not inquire why he had not been ashore, nor did he ask why I had not come aboard. His head was all right again, he said, and so, with no further parley, I left him. Maud received my report with obvious relief, and the sight of smoke, which later rose in the galley, put her in a more cheerful mood. The next day, and the next, we saw the galley smoke rising, and sometimes we caught glimpses of him on the poop. But that was all. He made no attempt to come ashore, this we knew, for we still maintained our night watches. We were waiting for him to do something, to show his hand, so to say, and his inaction puzzled and worried us. A week of this passed by. We had no other interest than Wolf Larsen, and his presence weighed us down with an apprehension which prevented us from doing any of the little things we had planned. But at the end of the week, the smoke ceased rising from the galley, and he no longer showed himself on the poop. I could see Maud's solicitude again growing, though she timidly, and even proudly, I think, forbore a repetition of her request. After all, what censure could be put upon her? She was divinely altruistic, and she was a woman. Besides, I was myself aware of hurt at thought of this man whom I had tried to kill, dying alone with his fellow creatures so near. He was right. The code of my group was stronger than I. The fact that he had hands, feet, and a body shaped somewhat like mine constituted a claim which I could not ignore. So I did not wait a second time for Maud to send me. I discovered that we stood in need of condensed milk and marmalade, and announced that I was going aboard. I could see that she wavered. She even went so far as to murmur that they were non-essentials and that my trip after them might be inexpedient. And as she had followed the trend of my silence, she now followed the trend of my speech, and she knew that I was going aboard, not because of condensed milk and marmalade, but because of her and of her anxiety, which she knew she had failed to hide. I took off my shoes when I gained the forecastle head and went noiselessly aft in my stocking feet. Nor did I call this time from the top of the companionway. Cautiously descending, I found the cabin deserted. The door to his stateroom was closed. At first I thought of knocking, then I remembered my ostensible errand and resolved to carry it out. Carefully avoiding noise, I lifted the trapdoor in the floor and set it to one side. The slop chest, as well as the provisions, was stored in the lazarette, and I took advantage of the opportunity to lay in a stock of underclothing. As I emerged from the lazarette, I heard sounds in Wolf Larsen's stateroom. I crouched and listened. The doorknob rattled. Furtively, instinctively, I slunk back behind the table and drew and cocked my revolver. The door swung open and he came forth. Never have I seen so profound a despair as that which I saw on his face, the face of Wolf Larsen, the fighter, the strong man, the indomitable one. For all the world like a woman wringing her hands, he raised his clenched fists and groaned. One fist unclosed, and the open palm swept across his eyes as though brushing away cobwebs. God, God, he groaned. And the clenched fists were raised again to the infinite despair with which his throat vibrated. It was horrible. I was trembling all over, and I could feel the shivers running up and down my spine and the sweat standing out on my forehead. Surely there could be little in this world more awful than the spectacle of a strong man in the moment when he is utterly weak and broken. But Wolf Larsen regained control of himself by an exertion of his remarkable will. And it was exertion. His whole frame shook with the struggle. He resembled a man on the verge of a fit. His face strove to compose itself, writhing and twisting in the effort till he broke down again. Once more the clenched fist went upward and he groaned. He caught his breath once or twice and sobbed. Then he was successful. I could have thought him the old Wolf Larsen, and yet there was in his movements a vague suggestion of weakness and indecision. He started for the companionway and stepped forward as I had been accustomed to see him do. And yet again, in his very walk, there seemed that suggestion of weakness and indecision. I was now concerned with fear for myself. The open trap lay directly in his path, and his discovery of it would lead instantly to his discovery of me. I was angry with myself for being caught in so cowardly a position, crouching on the floor. There was yet time. I rose swiftly to my feet and, I know quite unconsciously, assumed a defiant attitude. He took no notice of me, nor did he notice the open trap. Before I could grasp the situation or act, he had walked right into the trap. One foot was descending into the opening, while the other foot was just on the verge of beginning the uplift. But when the descending foot missed the solid flooring and felt vacancy beneath, it was the old wolf Larson and the tiger muscles that made the falling body spring across the opening, even as it fell, so that he struck on his chest and stomach with arms outstretched on the floor of the opposite side. The next instant he had drawn up his legs and rolled clear. But he rolled into my marmalade and underclothes and against the trapdoor. The expression on his face was one of complete comprehension, but before I can guess what he had comprehended, he had dropped the trapdoor into place, closing the lazarette. Then I understood. He thought he had me inside. Also, he was blind as a bat. I watched him, breathing carefully so that he should not hear me. He stepped quickly into his stateroom. I saw his hand miss the doorknob by an inch, quickly fumble for it, and find it. This was my chance. I tiptoed across the cabin and to the top of the stairs. He came back, dragging a heavy sea chest, which he deposited on top of the trap. Not content with this, he fetched a second chest and placed it on top of the first. Then he gathered up the marmalade and underclothes and put them on the table. When he started up the companionway, I retreated, silently rolling over the top of the cabin. He shoved the slide part way back and rested his arms on it, his body still in the companionway. His attitude was of one looking forward the length of the schooner, or staring rather, for his eyes were fixed and unblinking. I was only 5 feet away and directly in what should have been his line of vision. It was uncanny. I felt myself a ghost, one of my invisibility. I waved my hand back and forth, of course without effect, but when the moving shadow fell across his face, I saw at once that he was susceptible to the impression. His face became more expectant and tense as he tried to analyze and identify the impression. He knew that he had responded to something from without, that his sensibility had been touched by a changing something in his environment. But what it was, he could not discover. I ceased waving my hand so that the shadow remained stationary. He slowly moved his head back and forth under it and turned from side to side, now in the sunshine, now in the shade, feeling the shadow, as it were, testing it by sensation. I, too, was busy trying to reason out how he was aware of the existence of so intangible a thing as a shadow. If it were his eyeballs only that were affected, or if his optic nerves were not wholly destroyed, the explanation was simple. If otherwise, then the only conclusion I could reach was that the sensitive skin recognized the difference of temperature between shade and sunshine. Or perhaps, who can tell, it was that fabled sixth sense which conveyed to him the loom and feel of an object close at hand. Giving over his attempt to determine the shadow, he stepped on deck and started forward, walking with a swiftness and confidence which surprised me. And still, there was that hint of the feebleness of the blind in his walk. I knew it now for what it was. To my amused chagrin, he discovered my shoes on the forecastle head and brought them back with him into the galley. I watched him build the fire and set about cooking food for himself. Then I stole into the cabin for my marmalade and underclothes, slipped back past the galley, and climbed down to the beach to deliver my barefoot report.